If the seals are gone, then birds and fish might not be here either. So I don't know what the people would do if there's no crab and there's no fish, and there might not be any reasons to live here. Everybody that lived here would have to be on welfare. That's not good.
Hello and welcome back to the second episode of Tipping the Iceberg. If you have skipped the first episode, then welcome to the show. I'm your host, Silja Zimmermann, and I invite you to join me on a journey to explore the food system of St. Paul Island, Alaska. In this episode, we delve deep into the history of St. Paul Island. We learn about the past to understand how St. Paul Island became what it is today. St. Paul Island is one of the 5 Pribilof Islands in the Bering Sea. St. Paul and St. George Island are home to 2 Aleut or Unangach communities. The other 3, Otter Island, Walrus Island, and Sea Lion Rock, are uninhabited. 300 miles from the Alaskan mainland and 800 miles from Anchorage, the closest urban center, St. Paul is the permanent home to around 300 people. Please be aware, though, that this episode contains descriptions of the harm that has been done to the Unangach people. If these topics are difficult for you, you might prefer to listen to it with a trusted friend. If you decide to stay with us, that's great. And I promise you'll learn a lot about the interesting history of this special island. Let's dive right into it. We'll start at the very beginning. Lean back and enjoy the legend of the Fur Seal Islands, read by the wonderful Jill Christine Freitas.
Long ago, when history was still recorded in song instead of in books, there was an Aleut chief on Unimak Island whose name was Aquilina. He had a son named Igadara who spent much of his time in his kayak hunting the whales, otters, and fur seals that roamed the Aleutian waters. Igadara became highly skilled in hunting and navigating at sea, and often spent days on the open ocean hunting for the sea mammals that provided his people with food, fuel, and clothing. Each spring, Igadara watched the fur seals swim north through Unimak Pass heavy with unborn babies, and every fall they swam south again with their new pups. But although his ancestors had continuously explored the waters north of Unimak Island, no one had ever learned where the seal's birthplace was. One day, Igadara was caught in his kayak by a fierce storm that blew out of the south, and he was forced to run before the wind for several days. When the storm was finally exhausted, he found himself in a deep fog, further north than anyone in his village had ever been before. Through the fog, Igadara could hear familiar sounds of birds and seals. Their voices seemed to be calling from a land hidden in the mist. He pressed forward blindly until the sounds surrounded him. Suddenly, in front of him looked a great dark coastline. As he cautiously drew nearer to the stony beaches, his unbelieving eyes saw millions of fur seals nursing their newborn pups. There were so many seals on the beaches that he had to search for a long time to find a place to land. For a year, Igadara lived on this misty island he had discovered, gathering fur seals to take home to his village. On very clear days, he could see another island to the south, which was often clothed in fog and surrounded by high cliffs and seal beaches. In the summer, the islands were covered with all the brilliant colors of wildflowers. In the winter, the wind blew the mist away, leaving the snowy volcanic islands sparkling in the icy sea. Finally, when the north wind was beginning to blow strongly again, Igadara knew it was time for him to return to his father's home. He loaded his kayak with the furs he had caught and set his course due south. After several days of running before the wind, he sighted the familiar volcanoes of Unimak Island, and soon he could see his father's village built out on a narrow spit of land. The people in the village held a great feast to welcome him home, and the feast lasted long into the night. That evening, many songs and dances told and retold the story of Igadara's discovery of the misty Fur Seal Islands, which he called Amidst. In the years to come, these songs were sung many times, and each new Aleut generation passed them on to their own children. In this way, the discovery of Amidst by Igadara the son of the Unimak chief, was always remembered by the people of the Aleutian Islands. Eventually, strangers came from the west and spent many years searching for the same fur seal islands. The descendants of Iglavarak kept the location of the islands secret in hopes that the strangers would be unsuccessful in their search and they would return to their own homes. After many years of searching, the strangers too found the fur seal islands and their rich animal life. They of course didn't realize that the islands were already named, and therefore, in their ignorance, the strangers gave a second name to the islands. They named them after their navigator, Gerasim Pribilof.
I'm excited. Today I meet Zenaida Melovidov, or Kuka Z, as almost everyone is calling her on St. Paul. Kuka is the Unangan Tunu word for grandma. I feel a bit like Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on other people's doors. Hi, Z.
Oh,
Do you remember that you told me I should come over?
yeah, I was busy. Come in.
Yeah?
Huh? I was putting my groceries away.
Okay. Hey, Z.
You didn't have to take your shoes out. I didn't vacuum. I didn't clean house.
Oh, it's fine. Do you live alone? By
No,
yourself?
I live with two sons.
Oh, okay.
One of them works at the store. You know him, Joe.
Joe.
He's my son.
Okay, yeah. Whoever you speak to on St. Paul, everyone will tell you Z is the best cook for traditional foods on the island.
The kids loved it. Z, we miss your sandwiches. We miss. Z, everybody knows me. I cook. I always say I feed the whole community. Everybody knows. Because I used to cook for 4 or 5 construction people. You know, that's how I know how to cook. So you know where Destiny, where my granddaughter sells the coffee, the espresso coffee?
Yeah.
I went down there for 2 days, cooked. I made halibut chowder and fry bread. And yesterday I made corned beef soup with homemade biscuits.
Halibut pie is one of the traditional dishes Z is most famous for. I want to ask her for the recipe.
It's mostly the fish pie, the halibut fish pie. Everybody wants my halibut fish pie. You know, like them chicken pot pies, the turkey pot pies, they small, they sell. That's how it's made. It's like a layer. You make a, pie crust, make your pie crust and then layer, cook rice, boil rice. I flavor my rice with chicken bouillon. Flavor my rice, then I saute onions, celery, and bacon. Then I get my halibut ready, boil eggs, dice up diced eggs. It's like a layer. The pie crust and then a layer of rice, then the bacon, onion, celery on top of the rice, the eggs, then raw halibut. We take the raw halibut and put it on top the rice, and then we do it again. Season the halibut, and then top it off with the bacon, celery, and then top it off with rice. Then cover it with the pie dough.
Z then explains to me step by step how she makes mossberry pie, and sea lion soup, and lasta. Lasta is salted fur seal flipper. It's incredible how many recipes she has memorized.
Yeah, everybody knows my cooking. I started off, I graduated here from 8th grade, that's all. I always say, why should I go to college? Why should I go to school? I'm only going to get married and have babies and become a housewife. And as long as I know how to read, write, and numbers, arithmetic, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Before, when I was younger, I would say, I want to be a beautician. No. So I ended up cooking. My sister and I, that building down there where we had our corporation meeting, that used to be the restaurant under the corporation. We cooked there. And then we had a guy come teach us how to cook. The corporation hired this guy, this cook, and my sister and I learned a lot from him. So I know how to cook we used to cook for the tourists. The tourists would go down there and eat. Then later on, the construction people come in. So they told them, ask Z, call Z. So I cooked for about 4 or 5 construction companies.
Z was born on St. Paul Island in 1948. She grew up here and has lived here most of her life. And you can tell she loves her native food. Because she likes the taste of it, but also because it reminds her of the old days.
That's how we survived, just, as we grew up. Funny, my mom and dad never told us, he used to say, you better eat your food or you're going to go to bed hungry. See, if you don't eat, you don't get nothing to eat, because they had limit. But my mom and dad never told us that. You better eat this or we don't have enough to feed you. People, like my mom and dad, people used to go to their house. Mom and dad would bring out food, let people come in and eat and visit. I'm like that. And even though we didn't have much to eat, my mom and dad gave it out. Then they never said we're having a hard time. And here we had rations. They rationed our food from the store. I remember Mom making a list, go to the store, a grocery list, and they'd give it out to the people. It was just so much because of the family, how big the family was in the house. It was limited.
So that was during the time when the US government
was still here, yeah.
What Zee's talking about here is the time when the US government was still ruling over people's life here on St. Paul. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. Since then, the people on St. Paul were wards of the government. As slaves of the harvest, they were forced into the commercial fur seal harvest for low wages with little say in the regulations that governed their lives and sacred land. They weren't allowed to leave St. Paul without permission, and their culture and language were oppressed. But Z doesn't only remember the bad things. What else do you remember from your childhood here? How was life back then?
It was fun. We had coffee shops, one over here, one down here, one on the other side, and in the middle was the ice cream shop. The whole island was our playground. Mom and Dad used to tell us, don't go up the hill, don't go to the cliffs, don't go on the beaches. But we do it anyway. And they used to blow the siren, let them in 8 o'clock in the morning, time for them to work. Go up at noon, 12 o'clock lunchtime, then 5 o'clock in the evening, work is done, and then 9 o'clock in the evening, that's curfew. We had to be home, curfew, kids had to be home. We never had policemen here, just village BPSOs, and they were local people.
Oh, wow. Both of your parents worked in the commercial fur seal harvest?
No, just my dad. My mom was a stay-at-home cook. That's where I learned how to cook from her. There was 6 of us girls. There was 8 of us siblings. There were 6 girls and 2 boys. We would have had 3 boys, but one died here in the clinic from, they never knew about spinal meningitis then, so.
Even though Z, with her cheerful attitude, remembers many beautiful moments, life under the regime of the US government was hard. I want to learn more about the history of St. Paul Island. And to do that, I meet Aquilina Lestenkof, one of the cultural leaders in the community.
You don't want my name right. You just want to know who I am. Aquilina Lestenkof, sakta cooking, Tanarami kuren tanari cooking. Tar anrach chalarum kuren aranaking. My name is Aquilina Lestenkof. I live on Tanaramich, also known as St. Paul Island. I was born on Anrach Chaloch, also known as St. George Island. I am a lifelong resident of the Pribilof Islands. My overarching position is that I direct Tanauna Makka Singing, which is the Office of Cultural Affairs for the Aleut community of St. Paul Island, through its governing organization, the Tribal Government of St. Paul.
Aquilina is a woman who has an incredible calmness about her. She speaks very slowly, almost majestically. She has a friendly face adorned with traditional tattoos, and she has an incredible knowledge about the history of St. Paul Island. We'll start at the very beginning.
Our story, Unangan people, Unangan, is that our forefathers came here before a representative of Western society, the consumer culture, realized it was here. And we have accounts of Igadara, for one, was someone that was carried away in a storm from his village, one of the villages on the islands of the Four Mountains, the Aleutian Islands, and ended up here on Tanaramich. And that he stayed here long enough to experience what it had to offer, and he kept looking out on the horizon, and the story is that he saw one of the tops of the mountains, and that he went in his single-hatched ikhyach, a kayak, and went back home and took with him furs of the fur seal.
Does this sound familiar to you? It's the same story you heard at the beginning of this episode. The story describes the beginning of the people of the seal. But it's not the story you normally find in history books.
Now, what's written in textbooks and written stories is Gerasim Pribilof was a navigator, and that on a ship, I want to put my little quotation fingers up, discovered the Pribilof Islands, and therefore they were named after him, Pribilof. And there are written accounts that it was because, our people knew these islands were here and knew the fur seals came here, and maybe there might have been some person, one of our own, that let him know that there were islands here. I think when you say discover, you say they were the first people there, and that is not true.
So the Russian navigator did not, quote-unquote, discover the Pribilof Islands. The ancestors of this community had long known that these islands existed. Only they called them Tanachamich. But where did these people actually come from? Over 10,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the ancestors of the first Aleuts migrated over the Bering land bridge to the so-called New World. The first tribes that migrated over the land bridge were hunter-gatherers, who later became the American Indians. The second wave of migrants from Asia were seafarers, who followed the coastline of the Bering land bridge in their search for new food. The seagoing tribes who migrated into North America continued generation after generation to move along the coastlines, settling where food was plentiful and moving on when it became scarce. Slowly moving southwards, they eventually reached a place where the coastline turned westward again and became a series of volcanic islands that extended for 1,000 miles back towards Asia, the Aleutian Islands. And there, they settled down. Over time, numerous permanent villages were established on the Aleutian Islands. The Aleuts were almost completely dependent on the animals of the sea for their food, clothing, and fuel. Consequently, the Aleuts became skilled sailors and navigators. They learned to read and predict the weather and to navigate by the stars. They were an integrated part of the ecological system for the over 8,000 years they lived on the Aleutians. It is said that during all this time, no animal species ever became extinct, and that the elements of the system that involved their life were kept stable for over thousands of years. This was about to change when, on the evening of September 9th, 1741, a Russian ship silently appeared on the Aleutian horizon. What followed can only be described as a calamity for the Aleuts. The Russians were initially drawn to the Aleutian Islands for the abundance of fur-bearing animals, especially sea otters and seals. Fueled by the fur trade's high demand, they sought to exploit these resources aggressively. But they lacked the skills and knowledge to navigate the treacherous waters and hunt efficiently, skills the Aleuts had honed over millennia. In a desperate bid to capitalize on the fur trade, the Russians forced the Aleuts into servitude. Men were coerced into dangerous hunting missions. Women and children were held hostage to ensure their return with furs. This led to a dramatic depletion of fur-bearing animal populations and inflicted terrible suffering on the Aleuts, including violence, forced labor, and the spread of diseases to which the Aleuts had no immunity. In 1786, Gerasim Pribilof, a Russian navigator, claimed to have quote-unquote discovered St. Paul Island. Seeing St. Paul's vast rookeries of fur seals, the Russians relocated Aleuts to the Pribilof Islands to intensify their fur extraction efforts.
I'm going to identify that period as a fur rush. The consumer culture was all about furs and all about making money off of furs back in the 1800s, 1800s. And so the Russians that first came are coming representing a situation that they come from seeking to make money. And when they came to the Aleutian Islands, they basically wiped out the Chingatun, the sea otter population. And so I think when he came and everybody that came after, he being Pribilof, they needed a labor force to mass harvest the northern fur seals on the Pribilof Islands. And their likely labor force were people that they just interacted with on the Aleutian Islands and nearly wiped them out and had a thumb over them. They were definitely had a hold on our people at that time. And when they came, the storybooks speak of slavery, wardship, being forced to stay, which is true. And at the same time, if you look at the flip side, those of us that came and, quotation marks, had to stay. Those of us that were made to stay, it's a good thing we came, because I think the representatives of this consumer culture, the fur rush, would have wiped out the fur seals. Basically, our people employed their knowledge minus the mass killing of fur seals. That is something we did not do, but we knew you can't just take everything. You have to protect the females, and the people representing the fur rush, they just saw fur. There was no idea of how to go about doing it. There is a story of men going on a strike, and whether this was in Russian times before the United States purchased Alaska or not, but the Unangan men that were harvesting, they went on strike. They said, we're not doing this because we can't do it this way. We can't kill anything, and all of them, and started to apply their knowledge to this commercial harvest of the fur-bearing animals. So when they came, they took us away from an all-giving ecosystem, in a sense, and took us away from our skill set of securing our food. Basically, by the time our people came here, they were not allowed to tan the furs. They were not allowed to keep them. So you have a couple hundred years of this fur economy taking the furs away from the Unanga people that might tan and wear and use them before that. So today we don't have anyone that knows how to do that.
This is the story about the time under the Russian regime. In 1867 then, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for 7.2 million US dollars. With a change in colonizers, St. Paul Island and its fur trade came under American jurisdiction. Initially, many hoped that the change in governance would improve conditions for the Aleuts. But the exploitation continued. The US government initiated leasing agreements with private companies to manage the fur trade. Technically speaking, the Aleuts living on the St. Paul Island became federal employees. While this might sound like an improvement, the reality is that they were wards of the government, or as the Aleuts themselves call it, slaves of the harvest.
When the United States came on board, people had to learn a whole different language, and then they were not allowed to speak Unangumtunu. So people with different perceptions, whether they're supposedly Christian perceptions, supposedly American perceptions, it just threw things into more of a turmoil, which I'm sure there was turmoil when Russia first came. But now you had all this time that passed and things were probably settling. And then all of a sudden everybody had to shift all over again. For the Pribilof Islands, what happened was you had independent companies come to commercially harvest fur seals. You have one called Hutchinson Coal and Company, hence there's a hill here named Hutchinson Hill. You have Williams Havens and Company, whose foreman or the manager for the company on island was Dan Webster. You have the camp house called Webster House. So you had rival companies that were harvesting seals, and I think people were working for one or the other. These companies were lining the pockets of people that were politically leading the United States. There was this era of pelagic sealing, where all countries were coming and sealing, killing fur seals out at sea. And by this time, our people couldn't really do anything about it. We were not sea-bound people anymore. We were land-bound people by this time.
Being wards of the government meant that the Aleuts had limited autonomy. They were not allowed to leave St. Paul Island without permission, which was rarely granted. Education for Aleut children was often neglected, and traditional Aleut practices were further marginalized in favor of American customs and the English language. In essence, while the flag over St. Paul Island changed, the complex web of social, ecological, and economic exploitation persisted.
Sometimes we'd go to school hungry.
Here you hear Kukazi again.
Then the teachers would ask us, "Did you eat breakfast this morning?" We used to lie. "Oh, we had pancakes, we had toast, we had French toast, we had all this food." And they used to let us put our hand on the desk to check our fingernails, open our mouth, check our teeth. That's how the teachers were. They were mean. I didn't know in the olden days they had policies. The white people stay together and the natives stay together. That's why I used to hate, my mom used to let us girls after school go home and do our chores, clean up the government agents going to come and inspect the homes.
House searches, curfew. This was everyday life under the regime of the US government. But Z stays positive. So is there something you miss about the time back then, or was it mostly just a hard life?
Now, we had fun when we were growing up, There's a bunch of us teenagers going around. We used to love going from coffee shops and going to music. We used to call that one room over at the city over there, our jukebox room. After school, we'd go there and put quarter in the jukebox. We'd dance and go home and then do our chores. Then we go out at night. We'd walk on the roads going from coffee shop to coffee shop. They only had cakes and pies and coffee and tea. That's how we visited each other's, The movie theaters. We had a couple movie theaters. Wow. Then until TV came around and the films got too expensive. My in-laws, they owned the movie theater up on the hill here. Movies, so TV came around, the films got too expensive. They couldn't, so they shut it down. We had a lot of fun in our, that's why I always say sometimes I miss the government days. We had all that. Coffee shops, steam baths, the whole community was community.
As we speak, Z keeps returning to the subject, to the importance of community and traditional food.
Yeah. In the olden days, the people made homebrew. They got together all the time. People would go to each other's homes and visit and play instruments, sing, yeah.
So do you think this feeling of community and coming together really brought you through the hardships?
Yeah, yeah. Because people, everybody took care of everybody. Nowadays, it's you're on your own. Nobody helps anybody anymore.
I find it interesting how ambivalent these stories about the past are. No doubt, it was a hard life. But what they had was community, and that helped. But how did St. Paul finally manage to free itself from the constraints of colonization?
When World War II happened,
Here you hear Aquilina again.
everything just kind of opened up in a larger way than this little sprinkling. So people being evacuated from the islands, I think initially the United States government was going to evacuate just the Americans. And when I say this, we were not Americans yet. And it turned out they evacuated everybody. So when folks went down to the camps in Southeast Alaska, their eyes opened up more. They're now interacting not with only trees that they've never really seen before, but with other people that had freedoms to come and go. And so they start to wonder, well, wait a minute here.
In 1942, the government once more forcibly relocated the Aleuts from their home. The community was moved to internment camps in southeastern Alaska. The conditions in these camps were harsh, medical care was inadequate, and many Aleuts died from diseases and malnutrition. But the 2 years spent in Southeast Alaska had not all been suffering. For the first time, people saw a world where men were paid wages instead of canned goods for their labor. A world where people governed themselves instead of living under the federal government's paternalism. When they returned to the Pribilof Islands, it would be the experience of freedom that would ultimately be the most important. What they had experienced and seen made it impossible for them to ever accept again the roles they had left in 1942. Now they demanded the same freedom for themselves that they had seen others enjoying as a natural right. But it wasn't from one day to another that the Aleuts on the Pribilofs gained economic freedom and political independence. After World War II, the relationship between the Aleuts and the US government underwent some changes, but many of the exploitative conditions persisted.
Unangan people on the Pribilof Islands probably started to understand that life was different here than it was for people elsewhere. I believe into the 1900s, you have leaks in the system. In this case, you have leaks in the way the United States government was managing this fur industry here. It happened over decades. And then there was the commercial fur industry was still happening up until 1983, managed by the federal government, and 1 year managed by a local entity, the Tanalahusia Corporation. There was another legal actions being taken about how, taken in regards to the government pulling out, is what the government pullout is what they was. When the United States ceased to manage a commercial fur industry, basically the leadership at the time, Larry Merkuliev, Jason Bordokovsky, I think, Gregory Freitas, Douglas Melavidov, and a good number of these folks have passed on. They wanted to ensure that the community wasn't left with nothing. So there was money that was to be had to create the harbors on the island and to shift from commercial fur industry to a commercial fishing industry.
All these eras of colonization, the Russian era, the American era, and the forced displacement during World War II, hugely impacted the food system on St. Paul Island. Traditional subsistence practices were systematically marginalized to make way for commercial extraction. The Aleuts, once masters at sustainable fishing and hunting, were now limited in what they could catch or gather. They were governed by foreign rules that didn't consider the indigenous ecological knowledge that had been passed down for generations.
The eras that we've gone through on the Pribilof Islands, where loosely we'll identify them as Russian times and American times, and their impacts on the way of life now are still very present. I think we're quite an Americanized town. The way that we celebrate the 4th of July can sometimes be misread. I would like to think that we would learn from those times. We can learn from those times, but we do need to change the techniques and the tools and look back at what did we use before, how did we make decisions before, how did we keep our food, how did we gather our food, all of those need to be revisited. Do we fly all our fresh vegetables in, or do we make our own greenhouses? There are plenty of opportunities to change or to change our path. You can't go back and undo what we did. We do have this phrase, "Malaga Kansamtali," given to us by an elder. She was one of many that was taken to Southeast Alaska in World War II in the evacuation. And when she tells the story, and I've heard her tell it a number of times, she pauses because she has to stop herself from crying while she's telling the story because she's reliving the feelings of what it was like to be there. She said, "Malaga Kansamtali." In loose translation, it is, what has happened to us must respect it. That whatever you've gone through, whatever hardship, even the three of us sitting right here, we're right here, right now, everything that's happened to us in the past, good or bad, you just have to respect it. It was your life. You can't change it. It's made you who you are right now. And how do you take that and you go forward is the question. The thing is, we're still left with tools that the American government left us. For example, we have what are now identified as tribal governments, tribes. I don't even know when that word got to be used. I liked community. But because the United States, the whole nation started to use that word tribe, everybody started to buy into it because the federal government was giving money to indigenous groups of people in order to form their own government, support their own government. The sad thing is those governments are mimicking the federal government of the United States. I want to know some that are doing something differently, some that are securing their community well-being, but it does feel like we have our own people that just stepped into the patent leather shoes of American society. I don't even know if patent leather shoes comes from American society, but they've just stepped into the shoes and they're sitting around council tables doing exactly what the American government, following in their footsteps. You have to understand that we've grown so comfortable in our American ways, it's uncomfortable to be our indigenous ways, in a sense. It took us 200 years to get here. It's probably going to take us 200 years to get on some path that will be more true to who we are.
I think what Aquilina means by that is that the consequences of colonization can still be felt today. Much of the local diet has been replaced by processed foods shipped from mainland America, leading to health problems like obesity and diabetes. But the resilience of the Aleut community shines through.
We have each other, and it's not like you can drive to the next town to seek solutions, that we have to depend on each other. That's like an important ingredient. And because we stay and we have to have to process it, that's part of the resiliency.
What I take from speaking to Aquilina is that the history of St. Paul Island is incredibly complicated. The community has lived through unspeakable hardships, and those have left their marks. But despite these challenges, there is hope for a better future, thanks to the inherent strength of the Aleut people.
If it's so expensive here and everyone is leaving, what makes you stay?
My home, the seals, the land, freedom. Out there, rush, rush, rush is a rush, rush, rush world. Hurry up and wait. Nah.
I keep realizing how young the history of St. Paul is. There are still elders living here who experienced the fur rush and the time under the US government firsthand. I want to meet someone who was involved in the commercial fur seal harvest and hear from them what it was like back then.
Everything? I should have stopped, right? I'm sorry, I ignored the stop sign.
This is Jacob Merkuliev. Jacob is the mayor of the city of St. Paul and also a respected elder in the community.
Remind me again, did you grow up here or are you originally from St. George?
I was in St. George till I was 11, but I've lived in St. Paul for, as of the month of July, 57 years now. I've been the mayor for about 6 or 7 years now, but I've been involved as a city council member off and on since 1975. I was 20 years old when I first got on.
Jacob was one of the first people I met when I first got to St. Paul. He's also one of the friendliest and most dedicated community members I know. Always smiling, always up for a chat, and always on his way to the next meeting. Today he takes me out to one of the largest rookeries of northern fur seals on St. Paul Island, Big Zapotney. On the way there, he tells me about his life during the commercial fur seal harvest, when the US government was still here.
Kind of like with the decline in animals, I kind of try to observe them a little bit whenever I can. When I first came here, I'd go out to the rookeries. The rookeries were open. They didn't close them until, maybe in the 80s or something like that. But we'd go out on the beaches and rookeries, and they were really full, thousands of seals out there. And when the commercial harvest was going on, they killed about 15, 20, 30,000 seals a year. If we did that now, the herd would be gone in a few years. I think maybe we have like 600,000 or 800,000 seals here now.
I need to turn left here, right?
Yeah. I don't know if some of it is due to climate change, or then the pollock fishery started up, and so maybe they don't have enough food and they have to go further out to get food for their pups.
And were you ever involved in the commercial fur seal harvest when you were younger?
Yes, when I was younger. When I was about 13, I went out and they picked seal sticks that I guess the Japanese or something like that use them for aphrodisiac or something like that. So
As you probably don't know what Jacob means by picking seal sticks, let me squeeze in a quick comment here. Seal sticks are penises. They used to cut them off the seals and sold them on Asian markets as aphrodisiac.
I worked out there 1 year, then after that, for the next 4 years, I worked at a processing plant that when they had a harvest, they brought the seals to the plant and ground them up into burger for mink feed. So I worked out there for 4 summers. And then after the 4th year, I worked out at the seal harvest. I worked as a skin boy that, take the skins, and a watchman. I watch the seals before the harvest and participate in the pulling the skins off of the seals too.
Okay, interesting. As Jacob speaks, I realize how concerned he is about the decline of fur seals, but also what an important part of his life the fur seal harvest was, and still is, for him. Jacob still actively participates in the community's subsistence fur seal harvest every year. When we arrive in Big Zapotney, we stay in the car for a while, and he explains to me step by step how such a subsistence harvest works.
After we have breakfast, then we'd go load up into the vehicles that are headed out to the harvest and go to where we're going to harvest. Then when we go down, they would pick a rookery, and you go down, run along the rocks and drive the seals up inland, and then we'd start harvesting them up there. When they get them, they take them to an area and let them sit and rest and cool off for a while, because it's not good when they're too warm, and so we let them cool off a while. Then they call the pod, make a small pod, maybe 10 or 15 seals, and they pull them over to a certain area. Then the clubbers, or we call them stunners now, they hit them over the head and kill them. Then there's guys that grab them, and they used to line them up in rows of 5 or 10, and then a guy would come with a knife and stick it through the chest part in the middle and cut the heart or artery, and let them bleed out. And after that, another guy would come in and start pulling the skin and cutting it, and go around the flippers and get it ready. Then they'd cut up part of the head, then roll the skin back, and then flip them over and roll it back. Then another guy would come in. They have nippers, and they put the nippers on the skin. And there was a guy with it's not really a pitchfork, but it's a pole with a foot rest sticking out and two pointed things that's about wide enough to get around the seal neck. And that guy would put his the pole there and put it in the ground, and the guys would pull the seal skin off. Then they would drop it, and there was another guy that would grab the skin, and they'd line them up in off to the side in rows of 10.
What you hear in the background are Jacob's jacket sleeves. They rub against each other while he illustrates every single step of the harvest with his hands. As he speaks, his eyes are lightening up. It is clear how much keeping these traditions alive means to him.
Sadly, but some of the younger generation now don't really eat seal meat, but I grew up eating it. I remember eating it a lot growing up as a kid. We had 9 of us in our family, so sometimes subsistence was the way to go.
And I understand why. Throughout history, there were external forces dictating to the St. Paul Island community what they should and should not do.
Back in 1983, or all the years before that, the Friends of Animals were complaining about the government harvesting fur seals, and they say they shouldn't be doing that. And back in 1983, the government phased out of their operations here on St. Paul and St. George.
Perhaps you remember. At the beginning of the first episode, I said I'm an activist myself. To be honest with you, I am a Greenpeace activist, and that puts me in a difficult position. Greenpeace was one of the main organizations responsible for ending the commercial fur seal harvest in the Pribilof Islands. As good as the intentions to protect the northern fur seals were at the time, the consequences for the communities for whom the seal hunt is part of their culture and traditions were devastating. Greenpeace later acknowledged the harmful consequences of its seal hunt campaign and apologized to the indigenous peoples whose rights to hunt and make a living were harmed. But the damage to the people was done.
At the time when government phased out of their operations here, we didn't know what we were going to do. Things were pretty tough, and looking at the city council's budget at that time, I think our budget was running about $120,000 or $130,000 a year, and they had like 5 people working with the city. Then, when the government stopped their operations here, they set it up to where I think we had like 110 people working for the city, and the budget was $5 million. Around that time too, we were working on building our harbor, and then we got the money for that, and the money we got for that was like $50 million, and the city's budget went from $120,000 to over $50 million. That was tough, and we didn't know if we were gonna survive, or how we were gonna switch to fisheries. And when they first started to build the harbor, we were supposed to be like a 7-Eleven in for the middle of Bering Sea. The boats would come and get fuel, groceries, ice, and supplies for what they were doing. But after the harbor got built and the breakwater was set up out there, then a company came in and built a crab processing plant here. I'm glad they did that because that kind of helped our economy here.
With the end of the commercial fur seal harvest, life on St. Paul was again turned upside down by external forces. Once more, the community had to reorientate and started a halibut and crab fishing economy to adapt to the new circumstances. Today, fur seal harvesting is only allowed for subsistence at certain times of the year.
Go walk over there and look at the seals.
Sounds good.
Big Zapotny is one of the beaches where the commercial fur seal harvest used to take place, and where the subsistence harvest still takes place today. I want to take a closer look at the fur seal rookery.
Shall we go to the blind and look at the seals? I can already hear and smell them.
Yeah.
They're a bit stinky.
Yeah, I know. The ones that sound like sheep are the pups. They kind of go, the smaller ones. And when you look down there, the small ones with the light fur, those are the females. And the bull seals are kind of bigger and darker.
And the ones that are sleeping?
Right over here, you could see the bull seal there that's got the big flipper that looks like it's about a foot long and it's sleeping. That's a bull seal. Oh, there's one right here too.
Does it make you happy to watch the seals? You seem like your face immediately starts lighting up when you look at them.
Yeah, looking at it makes my mouth water. I like eating them. It looks like a lot of seals here, but when I was growing up, all these rocks would be full.
Wow.
Thousands of seals here.
What does it do to you when you see that there are less seals than there used to be? Does it make you sad or?
It does, because I'd like to see them here for a long time more. Some of the rookies will still kind of look full, but not as full as it used to be.
And what do you think are the reasons for the decline?
Lack of food is one of the big reasons. I think is excuse me.
No worries.
But anyway, I think some of that is due to climate change. And when I was growing up, we used to get ice pack that would come down to the islands almost every year, and now we see it maybe almost once every 10 years. And when the ice pack comes down, it helps with the cocoa pods, the small things. And if you have more of them, the little fish eat the cocoa pods, and the bigger fish eat the little fish, and plus the birds and seals eat the fish too. So that kind of affects how many animals and birds we have here. Plus the pollock fisheries and yellowfin sole is probably not very good because they drag the bottom and take everything with them, and it catches crab and halibut and salmon, and the bycatch on the what do you call it? Those boats are like 10 million pounds, and we get maybe 1/10 of that for our summer harvest of halibut. So that's not good.
Jacob is really worried about his seals. The effects of climate change and overfishing threaten what's been around him his whole life. But it's a tricky situation, he tells me.
Are you against trawl fisheries? Would you be in favor of that being forbidden?
In a way, yes, and in a way, no. Our Fisheries Association, Central Bering Sea Fishermen's Association, has some ties with pollock fisheries, and part of their pollock fisheries, they get money from them, and so some of that money they use for stuff in our community. And Central Bering Sea has been a good partner in the community. They've helped the tribe and helped the city. They put money into school and a lot of the other stuff going on here. So elders, we get like $4,000 a year for fuel and electricity, and that helps a lot. Then plus they, during the certain times of the year, they give the elders halibut, salmon, or crab.
Wow, so that sounds like it's a really wicked situation.
Sometimes you can't bite the hand that feeds you, or helps you. We don't want them, but if they're not there, there's some things that we can't have, and we're trying to work with them to cut down on their bycatch, and it's a long process. I think sometimes it takes maybe 10 years to make something work with the bycatch process.
What becomes increasingly clear to me the longer I talk to Jacob is how little the community itself is responsible for the decline of fur seals and the other species around them. The root causes of this decline are more global: colonization, overfishing, and climate change. And yet, the St. Paul Island community is the one most affected by the decline, because it's all connected.
Then, if the seals are gone, then probably the birds and fish might not be here either. So I don't know what the people would do if there's no crab and there's no fish, and there might not be any reasons to live here. Everybody that live here would have to be on welfare, and that's not good.
I have to think again about what Aquilina said earlier. She said, we must respect and learn from our past to plan for the future. I'm asking Jacob what his hopes for the future of St. Paul Island are.
I would hope we have some sort of a sustainable fisheries, and if we don't, then we change to different types of fisheries. And there's sea urchins here. People like sea urchins, and there's kelp and kelp farming, and maybe the people will diversify what they're harvesting. Reindeer, they're doing good. Maybe they should start harvesting them and sell the meat at the store.
In this episode, we learned about St. Paul Island's past and how the consequences of history still shape life on the island today. What I take away from what Z, Aquilina, and Jacob shared with me is the understanding that much suffering has been inflicted on the community over the centuries. But subsistence foods and the traditions associated with them have remained a cultural and emotional anchor for many to this day. I also learned how ambivalent life was under the different regimes and how the community eventually regained its sovereignty by building its own local fishing economy. Today, the people of the seal again face huge challenges. Challenges in which they fight powerful corporations and lobbies. This is what we focus on in the next episode of Tipping the Iceberg.
The snow crab population crashed in Alaska, but why? More than 10 billion snow crabs disappeared in 2022, devastating a commercial fishing industry worth $200 million the year before. Now, researchers are working to figure out what happened and they think warmer ocean water could be to blame.
This was Tipping the Iceberg. The show is brought to you as part of my PhD project at Utrecht University in the Netherlands and was created in collaboration with the Aleut community of St. Paul Island. If you liked this episode, please leave a review or share it with a friend. Idea and realization, Silja Zimmermann. Edit and production, Wiebe de Jong. Recording, Sebastian Reinartz. The artwork for the logo comes from Lydia Dirks. As an outsider, a white young woman from Germany, I am conscious of the profound wounds that colonization inflicted upon indigenous communities all over the world. I step onto St. Paul Island with deep respect, profound humility, and an earnest desire to understand and learn, not impose. The generosity of the Aleut community in sharing their wisdom is a privilege, not a right, and I'm ever thankful for this opportunity to listen and to learn.